All right, I think it's about time for us to begin. And so I think I'll need every minute I can get. So I think I'm going to go ahead and get going on it. We've been talking about the restoration. That's what Larson spent the last couple of classes on, was the restoration. What we'll be focused on tonight is going to be about something a little bit different, right? So it's going to be focused on a couple of groups that we probably have heard some things about. They both came up during the 1800s. They both originated, really, got those movements started in the 1800s. And I think they're probably both groups that are worth talking about because, as we'll kind of discuss some tonight, you have a lot of people who are members of these groups, and we have them around here, and they're looking for people to talk to. So I think it's worth talking about. So we're talking about Latter-day Saints. We sometimes call them Mormons, and we're talking about Jehovah's Witnesses. Basically, what I want to do in this class is I'm hoping as fairly as possible to cover three things. First, I'm going to cover the history, like where these groups came from, and I'll try to give, I can't give all the details, so I'll try to give the essential details. I want to talk about what their beliefs are, and again, I'm not going to be able to cover everything on those, so I'm going to try to cover the main thing on those. And then I also want, on each of those, I want to kind of talk about maybe what's a response that we can have to that, right? So what's something that we should consider when we're thinking about Mormonism or thinking about what the Jehovah's Witnesses would have to say? What's maybe something we consider as far as, like, should I accept or not accept this? And maybe something you would present to them as well. So we're going to start with the Latter-day Saints, so the Mormons. So if we're talking about the Latter-day Saints, who are some people that you know were influential in that movement? There's probably two main ones you think of. Joseph Smith, that's the first one. We'll deal with him in a second. And who's the second one you think of? Brigham Young, right? BYU. So Joseph Smith's the main one we're going to focus on because he's kind of the main guy. Brigham Young we'll mention a couple times, but we're going to mainly focus on Joseph Smith. So Joseph Smith is born in 1805. By the way, I don't know what that is in the corner, and I don't know how to get rid of it, so it's just going to be there. But I don't think it's going to cover up anything important, so it'll be fine. He was born in 1805 in Vermont. When he was growing up, the family is not very wealthy. All right, they're pretty poor. They end up having to move around a lot. His dad's going from job to job. But one thing that they do as he's growing up is they go treasure hunting. And they go treasure hunting using divine instruments to help them to try to find this treasure. And there's a lot of details that go along with that, but probably one thing I want to mention about that is that they were working for a man who was kind of directing them in this treasure hunting, and this man kind of singled out Joseph Smith as being someone who he thought would be very good at this kind of thing. And so they would use things like seer stones to help them kind of figure out where the treasure is. But I mention that because I think when we start telling the rest of the story, that might be maybe more important than we think. And it's something I hadn't known until I went through this time. I'd heard a lot of the rest of the story, but I hadn't heard that. At age 15, he gets a vision from God. He sees God and he sees Jesus. And he's already been thinking about denominations, the divisions he sees in denominations, and he does not like the divisions he sees in denominations. It's really bothering him. And at age 15, he gets a vision from God and Jesus, and they tell him the denominations are wrong. They're all wrong, and you shouldn't join them. Now, that's kind of interesting. He was already thinking about this, right? And then he gets a vision saying, yeah, I'm confirming what you're thinking there. At age 18, he gets another vision. This time it's from an angel. And I'm going to say Moroni because I don't know how to say some of the names today, but I'm going to say Moroni. He gets that vision from the angel Moroni. And Moroni guides him to this hill where there are these golden plates buried in the hill. Now, he's not allowed to get them immediately. He has to wait 4 years. He's got to, if I understand correctly, it's kind of 4 years to prove himself, but also 4 years where he comes back on the anniversary every year and kind of learns a little bit more of what he needs to learn. After 4 years, he's able to dig up these plates, but he can't show anybody the plates. All right, so his job is to translate these plates. Now, what these plates contain, these golden plates, is they contain the history and revelation to those who are in America really before like colonization. And so if I'm understanding correctly, it's kind of like we would look at with the Old Testament and New Testament. There's a lot of history, but then what you have is you have revelation about how Jesus, after he's resurrected, goes over to the Americas, and he has a ministry in the Americas after his resurrection. So it contains some of the teachings there, and it contains, like I said, some of the history. Now, the translation from this is going to become the Book of Mormon. You might say, well, why is it called the Book of Mormon if it came from Moroni? Well, it's because Moroni's father was Mormon, and he's the one who wrote these plates. Okay, so it's the Book of Mormon because that's who wrote on the plates. By the way, Moroni, if I'm understanding correctly, was a man, right? That's why he's a father Mormon. He was a man. He died. He's resurrected as an angel. Okay, so that's kind of, I think, how they think that worked there. So anyway, when he's translating these plates, I told you he's not allowed to show them to anybody, but he also can't just read them because they're written in Reformed Egyptian. So in order to read them, he has to have these special glasses that have stones in the lenses, if I'm understanding correctly. The stones are the Urim and the Thummim. That sounds familiar, right? If we know our Old Testament, that sounds familiar. And so he's able to read them through these glasses, but he has to do it behind a blanket or behind a curtain, and he reads it out to somebody, and they write out what he reads. Now, I'm just going to point out that a lot of what he ends up putting in the Book of Mormon, reads out to them in the Book of Mormon, a lot of it is almost word for word what comes from the King James Version of the Bible. And so there seems to be a lot of like one-to-oneness in that, which is interesting. I will pause here and say this too. I mentioned he grew up treasure hunting. So he grew up, looking for buried treasure, using divine instruments, and guess what he ends up finding? Buried treasure, and guess what he has to use? A divine instrument, right? He used to use these special glasses in order to interpret them. I don't think that should be lost on us, that there might be some type of connection there, right? That he grew up believing I need to be finding treasure and be using these instruments like seer stones and things like that. And he ends up using those kind of things. He ends up, at age 25, he ends up translating and publishing the Book of Mormon. Also in that year, he establishes the Latter-day Saints Church. He's their prophet. They moved to Missouri. I should also mention this too. Other than just being the prophet, he also had other visions. We mentioned about the vision from God and Jesus and then Moroni, but he also had other visions from like John the Baptist and Peter and James and John. And they told him that you're going to have the priesthood of Aaron given to you, the priesthood of Melchizedek given to you. You're going to be elders. You're going to have the ability to give the gift of the Holy Spirit, right? So there's a lot really placed on Joseph Smith, and there's another man, the man who Cowardy, who helped him translate this. But he's going to establish the Latter-day Saints Church, and guess who's going to be at the head? He's going to be at the head because the revelation is coming through him. And so you have a lot of that kind of stuff going on. He has a lot of revelations that help him establish a structure and the organization of the church. But not everything is great because there's a lot of tension that comes up from this. So there's a lot of tensions between the Mormons and those who are not Mormons. They hear about some of these teachings and about where it comes from, and that really bothers them. And they end up being persecuted quite a bit starting in 1832. Really, persecution really starts ramping up, and they end up having to move around several times because of this. At age 30, he ends up publishing the book Doctrines and Covenants. That contains another 138 revelations and sermons in it. This is another book that they would look at, and we'll talk more about this in a little bit, but this is another book they would look at along with the Book of Mormon that they would consider scripture, right? They would consider, inspired by God, and it reveals a lot of things that they need to know for how they need to live their life. At age 37, he reveals that living members of the church can be baptized for the dead. We'll talk a little bit more about how that works later on too. And he also reveals that polygamy is now allowed and actually sometimes required. Now, wouldn't you know it, guess who's one of the ones it's required for? It's for Joseph Smith, right? Now, he was already practicing this, but this is kind of when he reveals it to the church, if I understand correctly. And they do not, well, I shouldn't say all of them, but a lot of them don't accept this, right off the bat. They are very resistant to this. One of them is actually Brigham Young himself. He said, I would rather die than participate in this. Now, he ends up participating in it, but that's what he said at the beginning, is I'd rather die than be a part of this. And of course, his wife at that time, Emma, did not want to participate in this. But God had a revelation for her. And one of the revelations he had for her in Doctrines and Covenants 132 was that she would be destroyed if she didn't accept the fact that Joseph Smith had to participate in polygamy. And then if she tried to participate in polygamy, she'd be destroyed, right? And so they had an answer for that. And like I said, he eventually ends up having, I think, about 27 wives. I think it was 27 wives. And Brigham Young ends up caving on that as well, and he ends up having over 20 wives himself, I think. I will also mention this too, because this is revealed in Doctrines and Covenants, like I said, 132. But this is going back on something that he had declared in the Book of Mormon. So in the Book of Mormon, it talks about how marriage is between one man and one wife, and you're not to have concubines or anything like that. And now we have this revelation that comes back and kind of undoes that, right? And the Latter-day Saints have an answer for this. They say this is something that's allowed for a specific amount of time. Just like David was allowed to have multiple wives, Joseph Smith and the people of that time were allowed to have multiple wives. And I think they're also pretty open about their reasons behind that, and we'll talk more about that later on too. So you have that going on at age 37. At age 38, what you have is him talk about, that followers of God and those who are part of the Mormon church can become gods themselves. And I think specifically the way they would word this now is that God wants you to be like him, and which I believe is true. He does want us to be like him. But they say what that means is that you'll be creating worlds, you'll be creating people, you'll be governing those people and kind of guiding them into becoming gods themselves. Well, because of this teaching and because of the practice of polygamy, Mormons are very unpopular right now, right? Because there's a lot of stuff going on there. People are looking at us saying, this is not what we're supposed to be thinking. This is not what we're supposed to be doing. And Joseph Smith, I mentioned this too, at age 38, he also declares he's going to run for president. So you have that. But he's arrested, all right? He's arrested, and because everybody's so angry, a mob comes in, and they kill him and his brother in jail. And so that's the end of Joseph Smith. But it's not the end of the church. But the church is going to be going through a period where they don't really know exactly who to follow. You're going to have a split. I think there are probably two main groups that end up being part of the split. But I think there might have been more groups split off of that. But the two main groups are basically, one group wants to stick with Joseph Smith's family, and I think they kind of stay in the area of Missouri. And the other group is going to follow Brigham Young. I told you he'd come up again, and here he is. So they end up following Brigham Young. And Brigham Young has a vision that tells him he needs to head westward. And where does he need to go? To Utah, right? Now, there's nothing in Utah except the Great Salt Lake. And that's where they go, and they found Salt Lake City. And that was in 1847. At this time, I'll go ahead and just say this now, even though I'm going to mention it in just a second. At this time, whenever they found Salt Lake City and they're there, they have about 20,000 members, okay, about 20,000 members that are with Brigham Young. And this is really, when we think of the Latter-day Saints, this is going to be the group that we think of. It's not the group that stayed with Joseph Smith. That's kind of why we left them. But it's going to be the group that's with Brigham Young. In 1852, they make public the fact that they are practicing polygamy, and it's part of their doctrine, part of their religion. Of course, again, there's outrage about this, and it's going to be outlawed in the federal government. But what you kind of have in the meantime is you have some battles going on. You have the Mormon War over this kind of thing. And you have attacks on both sides. You have them attacking the Mormons attacking them back, kind of unprompted. There's a lot of bad things going on at this point. And what you end up having is you have, because of the polygamy and because of the war, you have a lot of charges brought against Brigham Young and then other influential people in the Latter-day Saints Church. And some of those convictions stick and some of them don't stick. But you have a lot of that kind of stuff going on. It ends up settling down a little bit, and Brigham Young dies in 1877. His successor, so the next president, of the LDS Church, which, by the way, I'm going to go ahead and say this. I'm almost to the end of it, so I might not say it much more, but I'm going to try to say LDS because I'm tired of saying Latter-day Saints. And if I end up saying LSD, just forgive me. All right, but the LDS Church, they end up renouncing polygamy in 1890. And again, this is already unpopular. It's something the government's coming down on pretty hard. And they end up revealing, hey, we're going to renounce this. Anybody who practices this is not part of the church. They're not accepted. And in fact, if you think about the Mormon Church, probably one of the main things you think of is polygamy. And they are pretty hard on their website and saying, like, we do not practice this. We are not a part of this. And we will not tolerate anybody who is part of this. There's a polygamous group in America, and they are not part of us, right? And so they make it pretty clear stand there. And again, they have to say, well, we understand that's part of our history, but God allowed that for a certain amount of time. But then he revealed to us that we don't need to do that anymore, right around the time there were laws outlawing it, right? And it's also questionable whether this is actually a revelation or not. It seems to be almost more with that president of the LDS Church. It's almost more just seeming to be like his wisdom on it. It's like, look, if we keep going down this route, the government's really going to come down on us, and we won't be allowed to practice it anyway, but we'll have a lot more life lost. And but you have it officially renounced in 1890. Now, what I put there at the end is I just want you to see the growth of the church. So I mentioned in 1847, so in the 1840s, they have about 20,000 members. In 100 years, basically, in the 1950s, you end up getting to 1 million members. You want to guess how they probably grew that much? Polygamy, right? I mean, and I don't think they were shy about this. I mean, that was one of the reasons that they practiced it, is so that you could have as many wives as possible, have as many children as possible. And they believed that's how the church would grow, is through children. And so you have 1 million members in the 1950s, and today, not even 100 years later, we have now 17 million members. I don't think it's because of polygamy anymore, but it's probably still expansion from those families, and then also teaching. But we've got 17 million members today, so it's grown very, very quickly. I think that's all I pretty much want to say about the history. Again, there's a lot more we could say. There's a lot of really interesting details and things like that, but I think that's pretty much what we're going to say about the history. I want to move on to the beliefs. And again, there are going to be a lot of things that we're going to look at and say, those are some pretty big differences, there's some pretty small differences, or I don't know if that makes a difference at all. They're going to say some things, if you look at their website, that you would agree with, right? So they would say, Jesus died on the cross for our sins, we're saved by grace, there's a Trinity, and things like that. So a lot of things that we agree on, but there's going to be a lot of things that are going to be different too. So I'm trying to highlight maybe some of the main things that we would look at, maybe some of the main teachings that they would profess and say, like, here's kind of what they're thinking. Again, this is not everything, okay? And I might not give the best explanation on everything, but I'll do my best. So I got all these from their website, so I'm not trying to make anything up, right, or go by hearsay, but I went to their website to make sure this is something they would proclaim, they would be open about and say, this is what we believe. So one of the things they believe is that there are other scriptures. I've already kind of talked about that. They believe they are comparable to the Bible, and they believe that they don't contradict the Bible. I might disagree on that, but they say they don't contradict the Bible, and in fact what they do is they extend and they exalt the Bible. And so their purpose is not to come back and to teach something completely new that just is like, well, that changes who God is, but it's to extend and exalt the Bible is what they would say. So you have the Book of Mormon, that would be the original one. You have Doctrines and Covenants, and you have the Pearl of Great Price. I think are kind of the main ones. There might be other ones that I didn't see, but I think those are the main ones. Also a part of their teaching is that they believe in modern day revelation. The way they described it is they described it as really a prayerful dialogue with their through their prophets and apostles and God. And what they said is that even though it's modern day revelation, like it's a prayer for dialogue, right? So it's kind of a back and forth, and God kind of, and this is what they said, expects us to figure things out, right? So it's revelation, but not necessarily always like very clear revelation, but he's expecting, humans to be able to decipher and understand and kind of figure out what he wants. Another thing that they believe is that women can lead in the churches, and their reasoning for this is because in Christ, there's neither male nor female. So they can preach, they can lead singing, they can lead prayers, but it seems to stop at priesthood. Only men can be priests. So they can preach. And so I don't know what the difference is there. If the reasoning is there's not male or female in Christ, I don't know why we would stop at that. But if I understand correctly also, they were one of the first groups to kind of push this idea that women can lead in churches. And so they were kind of at the front of that. I mentioned this already, but they believe that God wants us to be like him, and that we'll create worlds and peoples and govern them. And they don't want to use the phrase, we will become gods, because they know that's pretty controversial. I mean, that's kind of what got Joseph Smith killed, right? Was that the phrase like, we can become gods. So they don't want to say that. But this is the kind of language they use on it. We will be like him and create worlds and peoples. Now, this is the part that I don't remember. I don't think I found on their website, but I'm going to say it. And you can raise your hand and tell me I'm wrong. But I also think that possibly part of it is they don't believe that our God is the only God, that there are many gods and many worlds, and our God was once a human, and then we kind of repeat that process, right? Now, like there are generations of gods, basically. I might be wrong about that. Does anybody know?
I've heard the same thing.
Yeah, you've heard the same thing? Yeah, I think that's...
They're very monotheistic, polytheistic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's true. I could not really find that much on their website, so I just stuck with this on the PowerPoint. Yeah.
Because that's inflammatory speech.
Yeah. I think a lot of this is a touchy subject for them. Yeah, I think they know it is. All right, another thing that they do is they baptize living members for the dead. I told you that was one of the teachings that came, one of the revelations that came up. But again, they limit this. You can't just be baptized for anybody who's dead. It has to be a deceased relative. Okay, so you're allowed to do this, but only within certain parameters, right? Keep it within almost the church. And then the last thing they do is they forbid substances that I'm going to mention at least. They forbid substances that they deem harmful to the human body. And so I think some of these we might agree with, all right? So I think some of the things we might look at and say that can be harmful to human bodies, like, well, alcohol, illegal drugs, tobacco. We might look at those things. But they also say coffee and tea, and they used to say, I think, anything with caffeine, but then I think they kind of went back on some of that and just left it to coffee and tea. But that's part of their belief. It's like you cannot participate in any of that, and that is forbidden. Now, I'm going to point out, and I think I've mentioned this along the way too, there seem to be some policies that kind of go back on, right? The polygamy, they kind of go back on that. Another one, I didn't put this up there, but it was on their website, and I thought it was kind of interesting the way they decided to word it, is one of the questions, they have a lot of Q&A sections on their website, and one of them was like, I don't remember exactly. It was basically, is the Mormon church racist? So that's basically what the question was. And they were like, no, we're not racist. We allowed black people to be priests early on. And then they had a phrase which is really interesting. It was like, Joseph Smith was an advocate for the slaves to be freed. But then they said, and at some point around the 1870s, they stopped the practice of ordaining black priests. And we're not really sure why. But then, that practice is resumed today. And anybody, no matter their race, can be a priest. And it's like, that seems to be a reverse in policy, but they're not really sure about why it got changed. And I might have an idea, but they don't seem to talk about it. The second thing is that, again, there are certain ideas they seem to only want to apply in certain situations. So like the women leaders is like that only extends so far. Baptizing for the dead, it only extends so far, right? And so they have these teachings, but they're like, it can only be limited to a certain amount. And I don't know if that's based off of, well, to be fair, I've not read all of their books, but I don't know if it's necessarily based off the scripture or it's just saying like, well, this is as far as we're willing to extend these things. Okay, so I'd say those are some of their main beliefs there that we probably have time to talk about. So here's what I want to do. I want us to think about how we might want to respond to these things. And if we're going to respond to it, we need to think about what's important, right? We can't chase every single thing that's different. It's not going to be possible. So we have to figure out what's important. Now, I'm going to tell you what I think is important, and you might think something else is important. That's okay. I think really what's the foundation of their faith is their belief and trust in Joseph Smith. And I think if we can determine if Joseph Smith is trustworthy or not, if he's really a prophet or not, then I think we can kind of figure out what we think about the whole thing, okay? Because if we think he's not trustworthy, then why would I trust the Book of Mormon? Why would I trust Doctrine and the Covenants? Why would I trust the Pearl of Great Price? Why would I trust those things if I can't trust the man who wrote them? So, a couple of things I think we should think about. First, how does the Bible, right? Because they don't say that anything contradicts the Bible, so they agree we can use the Bible. How does the Bible say we can judge a prophet? Well, first of all, just because someone claims to get something from an angel, like Moroni, doesn't mean that thing is true, right? So Galatians 1:6-9, even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one that we preach to you, let him be accursed. So just because you're getting this from the angel doesn't necessarily mean that's from God. Second, to deal with the prophet himself, right? Not just where it's coming from, but the prophet himself. If we look at Deuteronomy 18, which I think Dad did a lesson on this maybe a couple weeks ago, but it gives us parameters for which we can judge a prophet. And it says, if a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, and I'm underlining that because it's going to be important in a second, but it speaks in the name of the Lord, if the word does not come to pass or come true, that is a word the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoke presumptuously, and you don't need to be afraid of him. Okay? So then we would ask, well, has everything that Joseph Smith has said in the name of the Lord come true? Well, if you ask, if you ask an LDS member about that, the first thing they're going to point you to is to Doctrines and Covenants 87. Now, we're not going to read all of this, but I tried to underline the stuff that I thought was important because I think you'll get the gist of it, okay? So first of all, thus saith the Lord. All right, so we agree, saying it in the name of the Lord. Beginning at the rebellion of South Carolina, the southern states shall be divided against the northern states, and slaves shall rise up against their masters. Now, there's a lot in between, but those are probably the key ideas. What does that sound like? The Civil War. That's exactly right. This prophecy or revelation was made in 1832, when the Civil War happened, roundabout. Yeah, in 1860s, right? Wow, 30 years ahead. That sounds true, right? I mean, he must really be a prophet. A couple things about this. First of all, the rebellion beginning at South Carolina, the Civil War does begin in South Carolina in the 1860s. But what I think he's referencing is an event that happened a month before he made this prophecy. So this prophecy was made in December of 1832. In November of 1832, you already have a rebellion starting in South Carolina. You already see the tensions of the southern states and the northern states, kind of clashing, and you know it's going to be based off of slavery to some extent. So in some ways, you might look and say, okay, that looks super accurate. But it also might just be him looking at it and saying, I think this is where this is going to head. I think that rebellion is not actually part of the predictive part of the prophecy. I think it's actually just saying hey, here's what has happened. There's a rebellion at South Carolina, and I think this is where it's going to go. Also, so that's one thing I'd question about it. Also, second thing I'd question about it is, I don't know if you can see this, but that line where it says the southern states shall be divided against the northern states, the line right above it says that war will be poured out upon all nations. Well, we know that the Civil War didn't go all over the world, right? They have a reason for this. They would say the type of warfare that was engaged in the Civil War ended up being practiced in the world wars. And so that's what they would say. So I don't know if I buy that, but that's their explanation for it. Now, here's what I'm going to say about this. Let's grant this one is true. Let's just grant it. I don't know if I want to, but let's grant it, okay? If I grant this is true, does that still prove Deuteronomy 18? No. Because you notice how Deuteronomy 18 doesn't deal with if a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord and it does come to pass, then that means he is a prophet. It actually speaks only in the negative. That's interesting, isn't it? Because that's how we can disprove something. So can I give you all a quick, it's going to be a math example. So, get ready, all right? But I think it'll be hopefully not too bad. So if I make the claim all odd numbers end in 7, real quick, do you believe that? Do all odd numbers end in 7? No, right? Okay, now if you're feeling the pressure and you're like, yes, no, it doesn't, okay? But if I said, well, let me prove it to you. 7, 17, 27, 37, 40, 157, right? I just gave you a bunch of examples of odd numbers that end in 7. So obviously my claim is true, right? Because I gave you a true example. No. How would you disprove the claim? You give a counterexample, right? And so what about 13? Doesn't end in 7. It's an odd number. Doesn't end in 7. I think that's why this passage is written like this. Is because if you want to prove someone's not really from the Lord, you show where they messed up. Doesn't mean they don't get something right at some point. But you got to show, if they're saying something in the name of the Lord and they got it wrong, anything wrong, that's an issue, right? So we can look at that and say, okay, let's grant that one. Let's look at another one. Doctrines and Covenants 1:14. So thus saith the Lord, David W. Patton, he needs to settle on his business and he needs to perform a mission unto me next spring. So he needs to go in a group of 12, then he go on a mission in the next spring. And this prophecy is made April 11th, 1838. So next spring would be 1839, right? So David W. Patton, I can't ever say that right, David W. Patton is going to go on a mission trip in the next spring. And no, he's not, because he dies. He dies in 1838, all right? Well, I would look at that and say, well, that seems to be a miss, right? That seems to be like where we missed something here. He did not make it to the next spring. He didn't get to go on this trip. Let's look at another one. Doctrines and Covenants 84. So this is the word of the Lord. So he's speaking in the name of the Lord. Beginning at this place. So this is Jackson County, Missouri. A temple shall be reared in this generation, and this generation shall not pass away until the house and house shall be built unto the Lord. Okay, this prophecy is made in 1832, saying there's going to be a temple built in Jackson County, Missouri. There's still no temple on that lot today. Now, again, they have an explanation for this. They say, well, you know, the word generation can just mean like a period of time. That does not seem to be what he's saying here. It seems to be saying like people are living today, and I think he thought he might be living, to see that temple. And there's still no temple there. Now, there's a temple in Missouri, but not in Jackson County, Missouri. But they still believe there will be one built on that lot. In fact, I might get this part wrong, but I think I'm going to get it right. I told you that split happened, and some of them went Brigham Young, and some stayed with Joseph Smith's family. I think the group that stayed with Joseph Smith's family, I think they bought that lot, and they're trying to save it for the day that they can build the temple. I think that's right, but I might be wrong about that. All right, well, let me ask you, what conclusion can we make if we're looking at these things and we're saying he's got some prophecies that are not true? Do you think Joseph Smith is a trustworthy prophet? I don't think so, right? So I think that's something that whenever you're considering the Latter-day Saints, you're considering what they teach, you need to probably be thinking about this and saying, can I really trust what's being said? And this is probably, if you ever get to talk to someone, I try to present this to them, right? And say, what do you think about this? I think they'll have, explanations, but at least try to present that to them. And again, there's a lot we could say about it, but I think that's the main thing I would try to hone in on. All right, next thing, the history of the Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm going to be honest with you, this is not going to be nearly as exciting as it was with the history of the Latter-day Saints. There's no magic glasses or anything like that. So, but it's interesting enough. All right. So I'm actually going to back up to the 1830s. I know it says 1870s. In the 1830s, you have an Adventist movement. You have a man named William Miller, and he starts making predictions about the end, right? So the coming of Christ, the end of the world. I think he said it was going to be, I need to scroll because I've been talking and not scrolling, in 1843 or in 1844. Didn't happen. So what you have is you have a split in the Adventist group. And what you eventually have, so you have different groups, and in one of the Adventist group, you have a man named Charles Taze Russell in the 70s. He becomes very influential, but also very controversial, because he starts teaching that hell is not eternal torment. Instead, what hell is just immediate destruction of unrighteous souls. And he also teaches that the second coming of Christ will happen in 1914. Okay, so again, the split happened because of failed prediction. So he's making a prediction. 1914 comes, doesn't happen. Well, we got off by a year because we didn't count year zero. So actually, it's in 1915, right? So 1950 comes. It didn't happen. Well, that's because we were actually right at the beginning. It was 1914, and it was an invisible spiritual coming of Christ when he established his kingdom in heaven. Now, they thought it was going to be a kingdom on earth, but it's actually a kingdom in heaven. Now, you might be wondering, do you have the 1914 opaque to show it's an invisible return? Yes, I did do that. And I spent 3 slides to do this because I thought it was funny. So there you go. But he's made these predictions. They believe in the 1914 return of Christ. He's, like I said, very influential. He has a lot of writings. Even though he's made these predictions that don't seem to come true, but he has a reason for it, they're still spreading his writings. And one of the main ones is the Watchtower. And in fact, he ends up founding the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Pennsylvania. Super easy to say. He ends up founding that. He's the president of that. And that this is what's going to, and you'll see this in a second, but what's going to end up becoming the church. And so whenever he is gone, he is succeeded in the president of the WBTS because it didn't stay in Pennsylvania. That's the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, WBTS. But we lost the Pennsylvania because they ended up moving to Brooklyn. But he's succeeded by Joseph Franklin Rutherford, and he renames the group to Jehovah's Witnesses, which I'm thankful for because I didn't want to keep saying the Watchtower Bible Tract Society. So I'm glad he named it Jehovah's Witnesses. But he named it this because he wanted to emphasize two things. First of all, he wanted to emphasize that they were the specially chosen followers of the true God, and that true God's name was Jehovah, right? And we'll talk more about how that's important in a little bit. But he also, Joseph Franklin Rutherford, predicted that the end would happen in 1925. You notice this is becoming a pattern. It did not happen. All right, so 1925 came and went, didn't happen. He's succeeded by Nathan Homer Knorr. So he's the next president of the Jehovah's Witnesses. And the main reason I'm bringing him up is because he commissions and publishes a new translation of the Bible, the New World Translation. So we'll just call it the NWT from now on. But he commissions this, and it's controversial. We'll talk about why in a little bit, but that's kind of the main thing he did. Also, the organization through the Watchtower Tract maybe didn't officially predict, but heavily suggested that in 1975, the end of the world would come. It didn't happen, right? So you have, again, a repeated pattern kind of going here. But I will point out this, because I think this is interesting. They are aware of the failed predictions. And what they would say is they say, look, the Watchtower Society is not infallible, right? Like, we're going to make mistakes. And here's what they said. It's not infallible, but we are more concerned in obeying Jesus and saving lives and avoiding criticism, which is a nice way to not answer the criticism, I guess. But, they say, hey, we're going to make mistakes, but that's not our main focus. And it's like, okay, well, at least they're addressing it in some ways. And the last thing I'll mention is that we have about 9 million members today. So let's talk about some beliefs here. So again, you're going to have some big beliefs, some small beliefs or maybe big differences, small differences in their beliefs. I'm going to try to hit the main ones. So first, they believe God must be identified as Jehovah. And in fact, if you ever have a Jehovah's Witness come to your door, or at least this is what happened to me a couple times, the first question they ask you is, do you know the true name of God? And I think I surprised them. It's like, you mean like Jehovah, like Yahweh? And they're like, yes! It's like, that's what I meant. So they're excited about that. Now, I will mention that that's not the only name ascribed to God throughout scriptures, right? You have like El Shaddai, Adonai, Elohim, right? But we're going to stick with Jehovah. And it's like, that's okay. I think that's fine. This is a pretty big one because it's going to influence a few things. They believe not only should he be identified as Jehovah, but Jehovah is the only God. There's not a Trinity. There's not multiple parts of this. He is the one God. There's one. So you might say, well, what about Jesus? Like, where does that put him? And they have an answer for this. And the answer is that Jesus is the first created being. And so hopefully right now you have passages streaming through your head. And that's good because I think we'll address those. But they say he's the first created being, and then Jesus created all other things. Another thing they believe is that once you die, you actually cease to exist, but then there will be a resurrection of the righteous and the unrighteous. 144,000 of the righteous will rule in heaven with Jesus. And then all other righteous people, all other obedient people, they will have an earthly paradise. So that would be like the kingdom of heaven that was in heaven come to earth. And so you'll have certain ones, special ones, who will be able to be in heaven. So they're pulling that from Revelation, obviously, like the 144,000. Which I shouldn't take the time to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. One of the first things they put on there when you say, what do you believe, right? The first thing that they have on there pretty much is like, we understand, like we believe in the Bible, right? And basically only the Bible. But we're not Bible fundamentalists, as they say. It's like we understand that some of the Bible is written symbolically. And the passage they reference for that is Revelation 1. And then that's from Revelation. And then the passage they would use to talk about how souls are destroyed is from Revelation. So it's like, we know that a lot's written symbolically, and they use Revelation as a reference for that, but then A lot of things in Revelation they don't take symbolically; they take it literally, which I think is interesting. So I told you they believe that the unrighteous, or they believe that everybody will pass out of existence at first. There'll be resurrection. The unrighteous who are beyond reform will just be gone. They don't get any more chances. But there are unrighteous ones who either didn't get to hear about Jesus, or maybe they were close to obedience, and they'll basically get another chance. If they accept, I don't know if they'll be part of the 144,000. I assume they'll just be part of the earthly paradise. But if they reject it, then they will also pass out of existence. So again, not eternal torment, but just a destruction. Basically just, burn it up and it's gone. It's kind of the idea. We talked about the second. Go ahead. Well, I think the idea is that they will be taught. So like they're resurrected and they'll be taught about what Jesus did and given an option. It's like, do you want to accept this or not? I mean, I don't know if it's that formal. Yeah, that's what I'm guessing. I guess I don't know the answer to that. I'm not a Jehovah's Witness, but but that's what my guess is. I don't know. All right. So then you have the second coming. We talked about that. Another point they decided to make is that Jesus did not die on a cross. He died on an upright stake. The word used for cross is either tree sometimes, or it's just, an upright pole, like stake kind of thing. And they would say, we don't really know what it is, but then they pretty much are pretty hard on saying, but we know it's not a cross, like it's going to be an upright stake. I think that's probably in response to a lot of almost like idolization of the cross, maybe what they see in the Catholic Church, and they're like, we're not going to have idols. And then the last thing is they don't accept blood transfusions because you don't consume blood, right? The life is in the blood. And so they say blood transfusion would be you accepting, consuming blood. Can't do that. God's against that. And they also don't participate in birthdays or holidays because those have pagan origins, is what they would say. So again, some of these differences are going to be pretty big. And some of them you might be like, well, it doesn't honestly matter to me if Jesus dies on a cross or an upright stake. I know he died and I know why he died. And that's what's important, right? I don't know I do think it's ambiguous, and I don't know if it's important that we say it has to be this way. But then there are other things I think are maybe more important. So let's talk about those. Some of their ideas, I believe, come from the translation they're using. So we talked about they use the NWT. And here's what John 1:1 says. And this is probably a passage that went through your mind. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God. Colossians 1:16, because by means of him, talking about Jesus, all other things were created in heavens and on the earth. And in Matthew 14, verse 33, then those in the boat did obeisance to him, saying, you really are God's son. Now, if you don't notice the differences, here they are. A God. So in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was a God. So not the God, right? But a God. So like a deity, but not the one true God. Then that's something that's added, by the way. In Colossians 1, you have all other things were created in heavens and the earth. That's added, right? It just says all things were created. But they had to put other there to show he was the first thing that was created. In Matthew 14, this one might not seem like as big of a deal, except the fact they make it a big deal. That word is worship in your translation, I would guess. But they put obeisance. Now, they don't mind using the word worship, but they only use the word worship, even if it's the same Greek word, they only use it when it's referring to God. When it refers to Jesus, they use obeisance. When it refers to other people, sometimes they use worship and sometimes they don't. But when it's Jesus, because he accepts it, it's obeisance and not worship. There's a difference. There's actually not a difference in the words. And I'm going to talk more about that in a second. But that's going to be something that I think we ought to focus on. So again, there might be, oh, no way. I got 2 minutes. I don't have time for this. All right, so let me say this. You might have questions about their translation. It was made in-house. It was made by those who are anointed, and there really wants to be one person who had the credentials to be a translator out of the whole group. So I think we might have questions about where that's coming from, and so we might have questions about what they believe based off of that. What I'd really like to focus on is the idea, is Jesus God? I think there are two things we got to look at. Number one, there are passages that are really only attributed to God and to Jesus alone. So I have Psalm 107, Mark 4. When Jesus calms the sea, calms the winds and the waves. In Psalm 107, you know who it's attributed to? Attributed to God. actually Jehovah, right? That's who's attributed. So when they say Jehovah, they say Yahweh. Well, that's who did it. And then you see Jesus doing that, right? And it talks about they'll cry out to Jehovah. Well, guess who they cried out to? They cried out to Jesus. All right, in Isaiah 43 and Mark 2, this is where Jesus, in Mark 2, you had the paralytic coming down through the roof, and he says, your sins are forgiven. They say, well, who can forgive sins except God alone? Isaiah 43 says, yeah, that's right. God can forgive sins, and that's it. And then Jesus proves he can forgive sins. And in Genesis 1 and Colossians 1, you have the connection there of God created the heavens and the earth, and then Jesus created all things. Now, again, they would maybe differ on the translation, but that's what's going on. Now, here's where I'm definitely going to focus in 30 seconds. The word obeisance is not any different than the word worship. It means to kneel down. It means to honor. When Jesus says in Matthew 4, talking to Satan, you shall worship the Lord your God, which, by the way, there says Jehovah your God, and him only shall you serve. It's the same word as the one that says they rendered obeisance to him. In Revelation, this word obeisance or worship is used for God. It's accepted. It's used for the dragon, the devil. It's accepted. It's used for an angel, right? Offered to an angel. It's rejected. But Jesus will accept this. So I think you have an option here, right? So if Jesus is going to accept worship or obeisance, either he is righteous and he's God, or he's unrighteous and he's like Satan, right? Because he's accepting it. If he were righteous and not God, he'd be like the angel and he'd reject it. And so I think we can look at that and, make a point about that, or at least confirm that within ourselves. All right, that's all I have time for, but thank y'all.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.